hoping that Ross or somebody would go into class early, but I guess they didn't. What time is it now? 10 till 10? I wish somebody would. Yeah, they are. Thermos.
Oh, like vermin. Oh, I'm hearing things.
Yeah, I am nobody's vermin. Oh my goodness. Sandy, I'm gonna let you let people in the lounge, and I'm gonna give you another shot.
Hey, how are you? Rabbi will be. Thank you. Cindy. Are you letting people?
I think so.
Yeah.
It's possible.
And everybody that was waiting is in.
Mike. Any more people coming in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we've got a big group right now.
Okay, so let me do something here. Sandy, remind me to talk to you about.
We need to check with the other rabbis and see what their Hanukkah schedule is going to be. Their classes.
If you guys are there, we're getting ready to get started in class. I can't really see anybody because I'm on my mobile device, but you'll see Rabbi will be here in a second. Can't find connection. That is Zoom address.
Are you having a reunion?
We meet down here at Torch once a month, just for everybody to kind of get out and hang out together.
Yeah. I have not been out of my house for 32 days now.
Wow. Well, you beat me by a couple of days. Okay, so let me turn this on. See, I don't know. Okay, so guys, tell me how well can you see everybody in the group?
That's great.
Awesome. Okay, Rabbi, whenever you're ready, I'm going to fix this coffee.
Are you managing it, Rod?
Yes, sir.
So you want to let me in? Give a chance.
Well, that was Sandy's job, but you know, I mean, if she's gonna sit and just wait for somebody else to do it, you know, she gets paid a lot of money to hit buttons.
In the wing.
Oh, hold on. Let me pause my.
If you want to make me host, I can let people in.
Oh, that'd be good, Ron.
Yes.
Why don't you make Nancy host so she can let people in?
Nancy, you
Yes,
are
sir.
the hostess with the mostest.
And this one person that I replaced.
Well,
We can't hear you, Rabbi.
Rabbi,
Rabbi's on mute.
he made it. Oh no, he's off.
Hi. You hear me now?
Yes.
I'm
yes.
definitely hearing an echo. You know what? Your speaker's probably on, so you're hearing it.
We hear you now.
Not just mute, but also turn off the speaker.
You were muted before.
Is it muted now?
I don't know. If you hear an echo, then no. Well, hi everyone. I apologize for all the technical problems. I guess if we do this once a month, in a year or two, we'll have it figured out. So great to see y'all. Nice to see you, Cindy. Wow. Oh yeah, it's great. Not everyone loves the Zoom,
Yeah.
It's better like in person,
You love the Zoom, but you miss in person.
Yeah. So I am very, very excited for what we have today. I'll tell you why. I was a little I reached a dead end in one of our studies, and Friday night I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, and I'm like, I hit a dead end in our 13 Principles of Faith series because I don't know how to proceed, and I particularly have some questions that I don't really have answers to, some basic fundamental questions. And then Friday night during davening, don't judge me, I was spacing out a little bit. Not spacing out, I was thinking about these questions. And kind of as we're davening, an entirely fully formed approach just materialized in my head. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. And after Shabbos, last night, it's really hard for me to work after Shabbos. I tell my boys they have a learning session in our neighborhood in the shul, where all the parents and children study together, and they get the kids some pizza, and they have a raffle. It's great. And then now my high school age boys are part of their basketball league. I told you about that. So we had to go to the game and come back. It's 10:30, and I'm tired and cranky. So I said I can't work on it. So I'm like, I'm doomed. Everyone's gonna show up in the torch center in the morning, and I'll just say, what do y'all want to talk about? That was my plan. And then I woke up this morning. I said, well, you're gonna go to the center. I spent a couple of hours to see if we could figure out the idea that I had, that germ of an idea that I had in the morning, I had at night, to see if we could develop that. And I'm very happy with the results. It's a little bit novel, as we shall see, but I think it's true. So I'm going to share with you with the caveat that I might still seek to amend it at some future point. But today we're going to continue our 30 Principles of Faith series. I'm a little congested, forgive me, like everyone else in the country. So forgive me for that, but I want to continue that. And this week, I hope to do another session, maybe on Thursday night, or maybe on Tuesday night. It's the first of the month, right? So we agreed to meet a second time on the first of the month. Thursday night is Hanukkah. So I'm going to have to be in touch with y'all whether or not I can meet on Thursday night. If not, we'll try to do on Tuesday night, if that still works. But there'll be communication about that, please God, upcoming.
We probably should.
Yeah?
We should do that
Tuesday? Okay.
We're gonna get a.
Possibly on Thursday.
Oh, okay. So Thursday's out. Okay,
Right.
perfect. So we'll do Tuesday, please God. And hopefully I have something to say, because I want to continue also our history series that we started. We did a couple sessions on history.
7:32.
Yeah, 7:30. Yes. So let me add it to my calendar so I don't forget. So please God, we'll get together on Thursday, and this will be exclusively on Zoom. Is that right? Exclusively.
Tuesday night.
Tuesday evening, December 5th. Yes. A date that will not live in infamy.
I believe that's somebody's birthday.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, we're sorry.
Why are you sorry?
Because it's your birthday.
So
It's your birthday.
what am I supposed to do? Well, is there any better way to celebrate a birthday than to study with y'all? I can't think of any better way. Okay, so I'll see y'all on Tuesday evening at 7:30 Central. Okay. It works out for everyone. Okay. What time? So 7:30 Central. Okay, let us begin. And again, there's people in the room, so just if you're looking at me, like this is what the room looks like.
I think they all see it too.
The girls, they can see on that side, yeah. So like we have like everyone there, hi, towards center. Okay, I'm gonna start recording. Let us begin. Today, I want to venture into speculative territory. No one said that trying to fundamentally understand the 13 principles of faith, the foundational pillars of our ideology and religion, no one said it's going to be easy and clear-cut, as if it's all spelled out and there's no questions. And I think today's discussion will certainly prove as much. We are in our fourth session on the 13 principles of faith, principle number 13, that is, and that is resurrection. And we've covered a lot of ground hitherto, even though many important and central questions remain. And today I want to focus on a few particularly gnawing series of perplexing questions that relate to some of the ideas and some of the principles and some of the tenets that we have already covered. And I want to suggest an approach that will resolve these questions and provide a deeper understanding into the ideas of resurrection that we've already touched upon. But I want to warn you, give the following disclaimer, that although what I am going to say seems to me to be accurate, and I think there's some evidence to prove it, it's not super corroborated by the sources. It seems like it's hinted to by the sources, but I haven't seen anyone that kind of lays it out exactly the way that I'm going to do it today. It's not quite as explicit as the way that we will present it for y'all today. And I want to begin with 4 questions. And then I'm going to suggest an idea. And these questions are all going to be sourced. So you'll have plenty of sources, but kind of putting it together, I have not seen anyone else do. And that's going to provide, I think, a much deeper insight into the concept of resurrection as we have seen it thus far. I want to begin with maybe a more general question. Last time we established that there are 2 types of resurrection. There's one in the times of Messiah, and there's one later on as a preparation, a precursor for Olam Haba. It seems like all the sources agree that there are 2 types of resurrection, 2 instances of resurrection. One's in Messianic times, and one is in the run-up to Olam Haba, where people are going to be born again, resurrected, for the purposes of their eternal fate. And we differentiated between these 2 types of resurrection. The resurrection types of Messiah, well, that's exclusively for the righteous. The righteous who worked so hard to bring about Messiah, who worked so hard to advance the cause of God in their lifetimes, they will be brought back to enjoy the fruits of their labor. They will be able to witness the product, the byproduct of their work. They'll be able to do all the mitzvos they were not able to do beforehand. You know, the Gaon of Vilna, as we mentioned, he never brought a sacrifice. Why should he lose out? There's mitzvos that can only be fulfilled in the Messianic times. Temple will be rebuilt. All the laws, all of them, will be operational. And the people that worked so hard to effectuate that, they will be able to participate in it and earn the benefits of the mitzvos. As we know, there are 613 mitzvos, all of them. And there are 613 parts of your soul, and there are 613 parts of your body, because every mitzvah provides life and vitality and perfection and elevation to another element of your existence. If someone did not have the great fortune of doing all the mitzvos, because they happen to have lived in a time where there was no temple. The Rambam, he lived in the 12th century. He couldn't have brought a sacrifice. Rashi never brought a sacrifice. Why should they lose out? Why should they lose out on the perfection that is attained with many of the mitzvos? They never observed the laws of Yovel, of the Jubilee. And therefore their soul never benefited from that merit of those mitzvos. And therefore they're going to come the times of Messiah, and they'll be able to do all those mitzvos, and they'll be able to earn the elevation and transformation of their soul that is bestowed upon it by those mitzvos. And that way in Olam Haba, their soul will be perfectly refined and elevated. And we talked about how the ones who are buried inside the land, they're going to come out first. And the ones buried outside the land will have to roll through the subterranean tunnels. And that is a painful enterprise. And the ones who emerge, because they're buried in the land, emerge first, and maybe even 40 years before the ones who roll from outside the land that we saw last time. And that's the Messianic resurrection. And then there's a second resurrection. And that is for the run-up to the eternal fate. And part of that is judgment. And we saw the memorable analogy of Rabbi Judah the Prince and the Roman Emperor Antoninus, where he says, well, the body and the soul could each exonerate themselves from judgment, because the body says, well, the soul sinned. Look at me, I'm totally ineffectual here in the grave. And the soul will say, well, the body sinned, because look at me, ever since we parted ways, I'm flying around like a bird. It must be that the body sinned. And each one can deflect culpability on the other one. And what's the Almighty going to do? He's going to reunite them together and judge them as one. That's what the Talmud told us. And that's what we see. There's a resurrection that's part of a judgment process, which, as we talked about last time, that is needed both to judge the wicked and to judge the righteous. Because if a sin is a byproduct of body and soul, well, so is a mitzvah. And therefore, if you need to have proper judgment, you must have a form of resurrection. And that's going to lead to the eternal fate of both the righteous and the wicked. And that's how we explained how Rambam can say that resurrection is only for the righteous, and simultaneously the Talmud could say that resurrection is also for the wicked, different types of resurrection. And we quoted a verse in Daniel where it talks about those who are sleeping in the dust, they will wake up, these, i.e. the righteous, to eternal life, and these to eternal ignominy. And that was the breakdown that we had addressed last time. What is not clear is exactly the similarities and or the differences between these two resurrections. It seems a bit, shall we say, inartful that there are two resurrections and they're exactly the same. That seems a bit strange. So what is the nature of the preliminary resurrection in times of Messiah, and how does that differ from the ultimate resurrection, maybe the universal resurrection in the run-up for Olam Haba? That's a general question. It's not so clear to me, or at least it wasn't up to this point. What exactly are the similarities and the differences between these two types of resurrection? A second question. The Talmud tells us, and we have cited this a few times, that the righteous, even when they're dead, they're really alive. Oh, and the wicked, even when they're alive, they are really, truly dead. That's what the Talmud says in the book of Brachos on page 18a on the bottom, going into 18b on the top. Tzadikim b'misasam kruim chayim. The tzadikim, when they're dead, they are deemed alive. And the wicked, when they are alive, they are kruim mesim. They are deemed dead. Here's a question. Well, if the righteous, even when they're dead, they're alive, why do we need to have resurrection? What is resurrection? Someone who is dead, you bring him back alive. Tchias hamesim, mechaya mesim. Someone who's dead, they're maced, they're dead, you bring them back alive. Well, if the righteous are alive, what is this transformation of taking someone who is already alive and bringing them alive? That's not resurrection. If the Talmud tells us that the righteous, even when they're dead, they are alive, then how can we attribute the term bringing the dead alive if they're already alive? How can we apply this idea of taking someone who is dead and saying, no, you're no longer dead. You're alive. You've been resurrected. Well, if they're alive, even when they're dead, there's no process to bring them back alive because they are already alive. That is perhaps a question. Now, I think there's an easy retort to it. Well, the Talmud says that when they're dead, they're considered alive. They're called alive. They're deemed. They're actually dead. Yes, the righteous, they're dead. They are dead. After all, they're not walking around. They're not wearing tefillin every day. They're not alive by our definitions and our ways of judging live people versus dead people. They're dead. So yes, the Talmud says sort of this amorphous, unclear, fuzzy concept. Well, they're really alive because maybe their soul is alive. That's how you would respond. And there's some justification to that because the Talmud actually says that the wicked are called dead when they're alive, and the righteous are called alive when they're dead. It seems like it's not that they're actually alive when they're dead. It means that they're just considered alive when they're dead. That, I think, is a very good response to this question. However, I will point you to another teaching in the Talmud. This is in the Talmud, the book of Tainus, on page 5b. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our forefather, lo mace, did not die. Jacob did not die. Well, what does that mean? So, of course, whenever we have a teaching in the Talmud, we have to see what Rashi says. So Rashi there says, lo mace, what does it mean he's not dead? Ela chai, he's instead alive. Le'olam, forever, he's been alive all alone. Here it doesn't say that Jacob, we consider him still alive. His death is not considered death. It says very clearly, Jacob, our forefather, did not die. Now, the Talmud itself challenges this assertion. Well, how can you say that Jacob is still alive? He never died. I read the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, it says that Jacob was eulogized. Can you eulogize a living person? In the book of Genesis, it also says that Jacob was embalmed. Do you embalm the living? In the book of Genesis, it also says that Jacob was buried in the cave of the patriarchs. Buried? How can you bury a living person? So the Talmud is challenging this idea that Jacob is still alive. He never died. We see parts of his story that clearly tell us that he, in fact, did die. Says the Talmud, no, Jacob never died. So why did they embalm him? Because he appeared to have died. It looked like he died. It seemed like he died. But he was just as alive as he ever was. And yes, they eulogized him because he appeared to be dead. But he was alive. But they eulogized him. And they embalmed him because he appeared to be dead, but he was really alive. And they buried him because he appeared to be dead, but he was truly alive. Thus concludes the Talmud. So we see, at least with regards to Jacob, the Talmud says very explicitly, he never died. And although that assertion was initially challenged, the Talmud concludes that no, he never died. Now, the Tosfos commentary points to another teaching in the Talmud. This is from the book of Sota on page 13a. It gives a detailed and dramatic account of the burial of Jacob. And it tells about the whole procession, the funeral procession of Jacob from Egypt to Hebron, to the land of Canaan. And the incredible eulogies that were done for Jacob. And then it says that when they arrived at the cave of the patriarchs, Esav was there, Jacob's twin. You remember him. And there was only one more burial spot left in the cave. In the cave, Adam and Eve were buried. Abraham and Sarah were buried. Isaac and Rebekah were buried. And Leah, one of Jacob's wives, was buried. And there was only 8 spots. And Esav wanted his spot. He said, well, Jacob, you already took 1 spot. You buried your wife there. The last spot's mine. And they said to him, but you sold your birthright. Don't you remember that? For that pot of stew? That red stuff? You sold your birthright. He says, yes, I sold my birthright. So I'm no longer the firstborn. But I didn't sell my identity as part of the family. So yes, Jacob has the first spot, but I get the second spot. But they said to him, no, you actually sold your second spot. Jacob made a big pile, the Talmud says, a big pile of all the monies and valuables that he had earned outside the land of Israel. And he exchanged it with Esav for the rights to the second burial spot in the cave. And thus, Jacob buried Leah in the spot that he owned. And Jacob himself was to be interred, was to be buried in the second spot that he purchased from Esav. That's what the Talmud tells us. And Esav responded, says, I don't remember that sale. News to me. Do you have any documentation? Is there a contract? And they say, yes, there is. But we left it in Egypt. Oh, alas. We left it in Egypt. So again, this is a terrible disgrace to Jacob. He needs to be buried. And Esav is stopping them. And there's this very long funeral procession. It's just held up by Jacob's twin brother. And he's demanding to see the documentation. It's my spot. Jacob must be buried elsewhere. So they sent Naphtali, who was a very swift one. He was swift like a deer, hustled back to Egypt to go get the documentation. He starts running back to Egypt. And meanwhile, everyone's just sitting around until Jacob's grandson named Hushim, he was deaf, the only son of Dan. And he's a little bit slower to realize what's happening. And he communicates to someone, says, what's happening here? And they point to Esav, that man. He's preventing Jacob from being buried. And he got enraged. And he says, until Naphtali comes back from Egypt, Jacob's going to be left over here in disgrace. That's unconscionable. So he grabs a sword and he goes over to Esav and he lops off his head. And Jacob is buried. And there's a postscript to the story. The postscript is, well, first of all, it tells us that Esav's head was buried, in fact, in the cave. His body was buried elsewhere. But the Talmud brings a postscript. The Talmud says that when Esav was decapitated, this is the words of the Talmud, his eyes fell out and they fell on the legs of Jacob. Now listen to this. This is the critical part. That's obviously, this is a fascinating Talmud. And what it means is, of course, it's a very deep teaching here. But the Talmud says that Jacob opened his eyes. and smiled. That's what it says in the Talmud, in the book of Sota, on page 13a. Jacob opened his eyes and smiled. Wait a minute, Jacob is dead, I thought. Dead people don't open their eyes and don't smile. So what does it mean that Jacob opened his eyes and smiled? He was aware of what's happening and he responded to it. Says the Tosfos, this is further evidence that Jacob never died. And he appeared to have died. And yes, he was eulogized and buried. And yes, he was embalmed. But he actually was completely alive. And as an aside, the commentaries note that even though it's halakhically prohibited to embalm, this is the reason why Jacob was embalmed, because had he not been embalmed and he would have just lied there, he would not have decomposed because he was still alive. And then the Egyptians would have deified him because, wow, someone's dead and they're not decomposing. So there was a temporary allowance to a dispensation to embalm him just to prevent the idolatry that would have happened as a result of him not being embalmed. But here's the question. Jacob was alive, is alive. Why is there a need to have him resurrected? Resurrection is saying someone who's dead and bringing them back alive. Jacob's still alive. Now, you may say, well, Jacob, for him, there's no need to resurrect him. The Talmud says otherwise. The Talmud says, when the Talmud starts to list all the sources, and we went through this a few times already, the Talmud lists the sources of resurrection. One of the sources is a citation that tells us that the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, will be resurrected, and they'll live in the land. So, on one hand, we're told that Jacob is still alive, never died. On the other hand, we're told that he will be resurrected. He's going to come back alive. If he never died, what's the need? That is the second major question about this whole subject. A third question. Rambam, of course, is the one who is guiding us in these 13 principles of faith. And there is a lot of debate over what Rambam, what his position is about resurrection, and the major problems that seem to be present in his position. Firstly, Rambam says, this is in his introduction to chapter 10 of the book of Sanhedrin, in his commentary to Mishnah. That's where he actually delineates the 13 principles. He says the following: death is a necessity, has to happen. Why? Because body and soul, they're different. And when someone or something is comprised of different components, the components eventually have to come apart. And therefore, body and soul must eventually separate. Now, what about after resurrection? If body and soul must necessarily separate, why would that not be true after resurrection as well? And in fact, Rambam, in his epistle on resurrection that we mentioned in the past, Rambam says, it appears to us from these citations, this is a quote, that the people who are resurrected and their souls and bodies reunite, they will eat and they will drink and they will procreate and they will die. When we listed the 10 questions of Sa'ad Yadron last time, the 10 dilemmas that he has about resurrection, one of the questions was, will those who are resurrected, will they die? And he concludes that they will not die. Yet Rambam says they will die. Those who are resurrected, body and soul come back together, they will die. They'll have a long life, sure, but they will die. And this seems to be very much in line with what he told us in the introduction to the commentary on Mishnah number 1 of chapter 10 of Sanhedrin, well, body and soul, they're opposites, they must come apart. Here's the problem. The Talmud, in the book of Sanhedrin, on page 92a, the Talmud says explicitly, Tzaddikim, the righteous, that the Almighty will bring back alive, will never go back to the dust, will never die. So, how does Rambam tell us that those who are resurrected will die when the Talmud says that those who are resurrected will not die? Rambam is not allowed to argue with the Talmud. He's allowed to explain it, codify it, organize it. But this seems very explicit. The Rambam says that those, he says it appears to me, so he doesn't say it definitively. It says it appears that those who are resurrected will die. The Talmud says that those who are resurrected will not die. How do we reconcile this Rambam? Now, it's also interesting. Rambam does say that in Olam Haba, the world to come, there is no body and soul. It's just the soul. And therefore, there is no death, because the necessity of death is only because body and soul are comprised together. If you don't have those opposites fused together, then there's no need, there's no necessity to have death. So evidently, the Rambam is telling us that there is a form of life that is bodiless and thus deathless. Well, if there's no body, then what's the nature of the resurrection that brings about that? Resurrection, I was always told, is the reunification of body and soul. There's a version of life, Rambam tells us, in Olam Haba, where there is no body. What do we make of that? So again, there's a lot of confusing things happening over here, but Rambam's position seems to be in conflict with itself and with the Talmud. How can we reconcile it? And finally, a fourth question that we hinted to last time. The Talmud says that there was a debate over the proper sequencing of dressing the high priest for the inauguration. What garments he put on first, what garments he put on second, and so on. And the Talmud says, what is the proper order? And the Talmud responds to that and says, why does it even matter what the proper order is? What was done 3,000 years ago in the tabernacle, that's already old news. That happened already. Why is it important for us to study the proper sequencing of the dressing of the high priest? And the Talmud says, well, it's still pertinent to us because we don't have a temple anymore, and we'll need to have a temple, and we'll need to dress the high priest, and we need to know what the proper order, the proper sequencing is of the dressing of the high priest. Says the Talmud, even for that purposes, we don't need to know the answer, because Moshe and Aaron, they'll be there, and they know the answer, and therefore they'll dress the high priest in the proper sequencing. They know the answer, and therefore it's not important for us to know the answer. So again, this is telling us that Moshe and Aaron will be around for the inauguration of the temple, the third temple. At least that's what's implied here. Now, where were Moshe and Aaron buried? We know that they were buried outside the land. They were both condemned to not enter the land. And therefore, based upon what we know, what we were told, their resurrection will happen at a subsequent date than those who were buried inside the land, maybe even up to 40 years later. Is everyone going to be waiting around for Moshe and Aaron to come to properly sequence the dressing of the high priest before the temple can be inaugurated? Doesn't make sense to me that everyone's going to be waiting around for 40 years for the temple to begin operations to wait for Moshe and Aaron to get there. That's yet a fourth question. Okay, so we have, I know this is confusing and it's a little bit in the weeds, but I want to suggest maybe an approach that will answer all these questions and will provide a new insight into the nature of the preliminary resurrection. And we'll frame it like this. Abraham purchased the cave of Machpelah from a gentleman named Ephron the Hittite. And this is told in Genesis chapter 18. Sarah died at the age of 127, and Abraham eulogized her, he cried over her, and he began to seek a burial spot for her. And he approaches the Hittites, the Bnei Ches. And he begins a negotiation. I want to bury Sarah. I need a burial spot. And there's a whole back and forth, a very lengthy dialogue. And they say to him, wherever you want. After all, you're Abraham. You're like a great celebrity. Everyone's going to allow you to use their burial spot for Sarah. And Abraham's very appreciative of that. And he says, I want specifically to speak to a guy named Ephron, the Hittite. And I want to buy the cave of Machpelah at the edge of his field, and I'll pay full price. And Ephron hears that, and he says, no, pay full price. I'm going to give it to you for free. And Abraham is appreciative of that as well. He says, no, I don't want it for free. I want to pay full price so I can bury my dead. And Ephron responded, okay, you want to pay? We'll just come up with some basic terms. How about 400 silver coins that are universally acceptable? And Abraham says it's a deal, and the Talmud tells us it was an exorbitant price. Abraham overpaid, but he was happy to do it. This transaction was consummated, and Abraham buried Sarah in this cave of Machpelah. That is what we read in chapter 18 of Genesis. If you read the narrative, if you read it very carefully, you'll find a few problems or a few questions in this back and forth. We know that Abraham is trying to find a burial spot for Sarah. But that objective is repeated 7 times. Once in verse 4, Abraham says, Ve'ekbara mesi, let me bury my dead. Twice in verse 6, they say to him, Kvares meisecha, bury your dead, and no one will stop you from burying your dead. That's already 3. Once in verse 8, he says, if you are indeed receptive of helping me bury my dead, so again, that's the 4th time it says that the objective is to bury the dead. Once again in verse 11, Kvar meisecha, bury your dead. 6th time in verse 13, Ve'ekbras mesi, bury your dead. And again in verse 15, Ve'es meischa kvar, and you're dead, you should bury. It seems very redundant. You read the whole dialogue, the whole narrative. It seems like it's repeating again and again and again and again that Abraham wants to buy this piece of property for the purposes of burying his dead. Why would I need to say it so many times? Of course, the Torah is very judicious in its use of words. It doesn't just repeat themes that we already know. It never says things which are extraneous. Why does it repeat that Abraham's objective in purchasing this piece of land is for the purposes of burying his dead? Why does it say it 7 times? Question number 2 is that it talks 7 times about burying the dead, but the first 6 times, the word bury appears before the word dead. Bury my dead, bury my dead, bury my dead. The last time, the 7th time, Ve'es meischa kevar, you're dead, you should bury. It switches the order. First it says dead, and then it says bury. Why is there that change? Should be consistent all throughout. So the Gaon of Vilna, he says something unbelievable. And I actually spoke about this in a Parsha podcast a few weeks ago. How many people were buried in the cave of Machpelah? So at the time that Abram made this purchase, there were already 2 people buried there, Adam and Eve. But afterwards, there's 6 more spots, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. But there's another person who was somewhat buried there, and that is Esav. His head is buried. His body's buried elsewhere. Says the Gaon of Vilna, the verse is hinting, when it says 7 times that dead people will be buried there, or buried there will be dead people, it's hinting to the 7 people that will be interred in this site after this purchase. And the first 6 who are buried, when the verse describes that, it says, bury your dead. They will be buried alive. The burial will happen before they die, because they're righteous. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah are all righteous. And those people, when they're dead, you may think they're dead, but they're really alive. Jacob opened his eyes and smiled. He appeared to be dead, so he was eulogized. And he was embalmed, but he was alive. But he was buried. Yes, he was buried, but he was buried when he was still alive. He didn't die yet. And therefore, the word to bury will precede the word die, because they will die only after they're buried. Whereas Esav, he was dead. He's wicked. He's dead even when he's alive. And therefore, the 7th time that it mentions this, the nature of this transaction, it says, Ves meischa kavar, you're dead, bury. That's a reference to Esav, because he will be dead before he is buried. That is what the Gaon of Vilna says. And he quotes the Talmud that we mentioned earlier, Brachos 18a and 18b. The righteous are alive even when they're dead. Abraham, is he righteous? Yes. So he's alive even when he's dead. But he was buried. Yes, he was buried, but he hadn't quite died yet. Sarah, is she righteous? Sure. So when she's dead, she's still alive. So she was buried before she died. Isaac and Rebekah, are they righteous? Sure. So the word bury appears before the word alive, before dead. Jacob and Leah, same thing. Buried alive. Esav, he's wicked. Meischa kavar, dead, you should bury. That is what the Gaon of Vilna says. How do we understand this? Okay, to wrap it all up, I'm going to quote one more citation from the Talmud. And this, I think, will illuminate everything that we've broached so far. The Talmud says, gives a story. Rav Nachman, one of the great sages of the Talmudic era, he had a large field, and he was doing some excavations on his field. And the people who were digging up the field, they dig up a grave. And the problem is that the person buried there seems to be alive, because he starts screaming at them. What are you doing? Don't you see I'm sleeping here? The dead starts to castigate them and reprimand them. So they, of course, freak out. And they go to Rav Nachman. And they say that there's a person who was buried in your land, and we dug it up. This is the Talmud, by the way, the book of Shabbos, page 152b. We dug it up, and he started to reprimand us and castigate us. Okay, that's obviously something which should catch your attention. So he runs over there, sees the grave, and sees the guy there. And he says, well, who are you? And he says, my name is Achoi, the son of Yoshia. Okay. And Rav Nachman is a little bit perplexed by this. He says, wait a minute. How is it possible that you're alive if you've been buried? Don't we know? Don't we have a tradition in the name of Rav Mari that the righteous will turn into dust? That's what he tells the dead guy. Dead, but he's talking to me. He says, Rav Mari? I don't know who that is. I'm sorry, I'm not beholden to some Rav Mari guy that you're quoting. So Rav Nachman tries a different tactic. He says, I have a verse in scripture that tells me that the righteous will die. It tells us that the body, will return to the dust from whence it came. So you may not know who Rav Mari is, but you certainly know what the verse says. The verse says that after people die, their body will be restored to the dust from which it came. And therefore, how am I talking to you? Why are you still alive? So he says, yeah, well, you just quoted me a citation from Koheles, from Ecclesiastes. You obviously didn't learn all of Tanakh. Because had you read the book of Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, you would know that it's possible for people to not actually be buried, to not actually die, to not return to their dust. And he quotes from a verse in Proverbs, chapter 14, verse 30. V'rekev atzamos kina. The rotting of the bones is envy. If someone's envious, their bones will rot. They'll die. If someone's not envious, their bones will not rot. So don't quote me a verse in Ecclesiastes. I'll quote you a verse in Proverbs that says, well, if you don't have envy, you won't die. Period. And I didn't have any envy, so I'm not dead. And that's how I can explain this unusual phenomenon of digging up a dead body. You thought it was dead. The guy's alive. He's talking to us. He's rebuking us. And now he's explaining the verse that substantiates his life even in the grave. Okay. So Rav Nachman is still not convinced. And he starts to pokes him. And he realized, like, this is not like some sort of a hologram. Like he feels it's a person. He has substance. So like, okay, obviously I learned something. You learn something new every day, right? He says to him, okay, Mr. Achai, why don't you come out? Come out of this uncomfortable grave and come to my house and we'll talk it over, a cup of tea. And he says, you saying something so foolish. Not only didn't you read Proverbs, you didn't even read the book of the prophets. And he quotes him a verse in Ezekiel. V'yidatem, and you should know, Kani Hashem, I am Hashem. Bepischi es kivrosechem, when I will open up your graves. The verse in Ezekiel, chapter 37, verse 13 says, it is God who opens the graves, not you, Rav Nachman. So I'm sorry, I ain't going to have lunch with you. Only God will open my grave. Thus concludes. No, I'm sorry. One more thing here. Only God will open the grave, not you. That is why I cannot join you for lunch. Now, Rav Nachman is still not fully okay with what he learned. And he says, well, we haven't addressed the verse in Genesis that says, Afar ata, you are dust. Ve'el afar tashuv, and you shall return to dust. That seems to imply that death is a necessity, an inescapable necessity. Everyone thought you were dead. I find out you're alive. Are you waiting for God to open up your grave? Well, how will you fulfill this verse that says that you are dust and you shall return to dust? So he responds, that verse is talking about the future. A moment before resurrection. A moment before resurrection, the righteous will die and will be resurrected. I'm still alive now. I'm still alive. I wasn't envious, and therefore my bones don't rot. I'm 100% alive, but I will die in the future just a moment before resurrection. Here's what I think. There are two types of resurrection that we know. It's been established. Times of Messiah and in the run-up for Olam Haba. There's one type of resurrection that's called God opening the graves. What does that mean? The people who are there, like this Achai person, in the Talmud. There's nothing that's really preventing him from getting out and going with Rav Nachman and going to his house. But he's waiting for God to do it. He was unnaturally dug up and exhumed, but he's not going to come join the party until God opens his grave. What that means is that there really isn't a resurrection per se. He's alive now. He's alive now. Nothing that's stopping him. If you were to just isolate this Achai person, he's talking, he has substance. The only thing that's stopping him from going to Rav Nachman's house is only because, well, God didn't open the grave, and therefore I'm not going. Are we calling this resurrection? We're calling it almost like an opening of the grave and taking those who are still alive, taking them out. Perhaps that is the resurrection of Messiah. All the righteous who are deemed alive when they're dead, maybe they look to us to be dead, but they're actually alive. And we have Jacob, and we have this Achai individual. We have the 6 people who are buried in the cave. They were buried before they died. Abraham, he's still alive. He didn't die yet. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob never died. Leah, Moshe, Aaron. The people who are righteous are still alive. If God just opens the grave, they can walk right out. Of course, we know that Elijah ascended to heaven in a fiery chariot. In the Talmud, in the book of one of the minor tractates of the Talmud, Derech Eretz Zuta, it lists 9 people who entered paradise, entered heaven, alive. And they are Chanoch, Enoch, I think is how you pronounce his name in English. Elijah, Mashiach, we don't know who that is, right? Eliezer, servant of Abraham, Hiram, king of Tzur, Evan Melech, the Cushite, Yavitz, the son of Rabbi Judah the prince, Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, Serach, the daughter of Asher, and some say even Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. We have a list here of 9, maybe 10 people who went alive into heaven. They haven't died yet. Maybe all the righteous who are deemed alive when they're dead, in times of Messiah, they come alive because they actually never died. And that's the messianic resurrection. It's simply the opening of the grave that God will do. And taking out those who were always alive, just taking them out. And the resurrection that we're talking about, where there's taking those who are dead and bringing them back alive, that's in the future. Where even those who were righteous and never died when they initially, so to speak, died, a moment before the resurrection, they will die so that they, in fact, can be resurrected. Meaning they could go from being dead to being alive. And I think this resolves all of our questions. And it's, again, a very advanced level study. And that's what we, that was the bargain here. If we wanted to subsist with simple, just reading of the 13 principles, we could have finished it a very long time ago. We started in not January, I don't remember exactly when, but we started in 2019. It's almost 2024 when we are recording this. It's a long time ago. We could have just said, well, there's lots of principles, go read them yourself. If you read the Ani Mamins, which is the distillation of these principles, you could do it in about 2 minutes. But that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to really understand at a fundamental level. And I think this seems to me to be a way to resolve all of our questions. Our first question was, well, what do we do of this system of resurrection? There's 2 resurrections. There's one at the times of Messiah, and just the same thing happens again in the future. It seems kind of a bit, we called it inartful. Now we are seeing perhaps that there are 2 very types of resurrection. In times of Messiah, you open the grave and allow those who are living in the perhaps claustrophobic sleeping pods, you allow them to come out. They never died. They are simply being woken up from a long sleep. And they'll come alive and they'll enjoy the times of Messiah. They're not dead yet, but they will die. Everyone who has a body must die, Rambam tells us. If you're comprised of opposites, those themes have to go back to their component parts. They will die. Even when Abraham and the Hittites were negotiating, they talked about 6 times bury the dead. Those 6 people will be buried first, but then they will die a moment before the resurrection. There's still death just to facilitate the rebirth, the renaissance of resurrection. And that is the second resurrection in the run-up for Olam Haba. And in that resurrection, in that form of resurrection, the people will be born again. People who died, the righteous who died an instant beforehand, everyone else who died, actually died beforehand, they will be brought back in a very different way, in a way that can even tolerate eternal life, perhaps without a body. We ask the question, why is there a need to resurrect Jacob? He didn't die. The truth is, there really isn't. There's a form of resurrection that's not to take someone who's dead and bring him alive. It's just to open up the grave and allow those who are living to emerge. Rambam said some confusing and contradictory statements. He tells us that those who are part of the initial resurrection, well, they're going to die. And we ask the question, well, the Talmud says otherwise, says those who are resurrected will not die. The answer is that the Rambam is talking about the resurrection of Messiah, where those who have never yet died just come out. And they will indeed have to die in the future, but they've never died yet before. They haven't. That's not the resurrection that's being addressed by the Talmud, which is the ultimate resurrection in the run-up for Olam Haba. Those people who come alive will in fact not die. The ones who will come alive as a Messiah have in fact yet to die. Oh, and Moshe and Aaron, they just open the grave and they can waltz into the temple and dress the high priest properly. There's a seamless re-entry because after all, they've never died. I think this is a way to understand all of our questions. It's a much deeper take on this subject. I think it's a deeper take on the nature of the initial resurrection times of Messiah. And again, I'm just simply using the words of the Talmud. The Talmud in the book of Shabbos 152 quotes the verse in Ezekiel, this is the opening of the graves. And that's just opening the grave, and once you open it, there's nothing that prevents those who were buried there to just come out because they're alive. And yes, when we look at them, we cannot see that life. We will look at Jacob and say, well, he needs to be buried because he's dead. Maybe we should embalm him. We should certainly eulogize him. But like Abraham and Ephron in their negotiations told us, there are 6 people who were buried before they died. Like the Talmud tells us, the righteous are deemed alive when they're dead. Jacob never died. And we understand that to be literal. Yes, we cannot perceive it, but it's literal. And there's even a conversation with someone who was dead, recorded and documented in the Talmud. Open the grave, they can come out. But there will be a second resurrection. And that's not simply opening the grave and allowing those who were buried to walk out. That's a complete reinvention of what it even means to be a human. It's a rebirth of a human that is completely different than how we perceive humans today. Today, Rambam tells us a human is a body and soul. Opposites must come apart. Death is a necessity in the current orientation of humanity. The righteous will come back alive in a capacity, in a way, in a means, with a means of never dying. And that is taking those who are dead and bringing them back alive. And what that means is some people have been dead for a very, very long time. Abraham and the 6 people, maybe the 9 people or the 10 people who were entered heaven alive, and the person recorded in the Talmud, they're still alive. They will merit the resurrection of the dead because a second before that ultimate resurrection, they in fact will die, just to facilitate the benefit of death and rebirth. I think this is true. I'm convinced it's true. Well, let me rephrase that. It seems to me that this is true. This orientation, this framing of these 2 resurrections. Of course, there are a lot of questions that still remain. I don't think that anything that we say on the subject will be universally accepted because there's so much nuance and so much debate. And again, when the medieval sages themselves address these subjects, they have very lengthy debates over them. So we still have to get more into the various nuances and the various other areas that cascade out of this subject. But I think that this is the proper way, or a proper way, to understand the Messianic resurrection. I think it resolves all of our questions. And again, we still have a lot to talk about. But this, I think, again, I want to give the disclaimer again. There's a little bit of speculation here. We're speculating an answer. It's implied, I think, in the sources. It seems to me legitimate, and it will resolve all of our questions. But I want to make it very clear, because whenever we discuss the 13 principles of faith, whenever we discuss the 13 principles of faith, I strive very much to source everything. You don't want to hear my opinions on these lofty matters. Or maybe you do, but I don't want to give you my opinions. My opinions don't really carry weight. Because we have our sages, and we have the Talmud, and we have the Midrash, and we have the Rambam. These are the reputable, authoritative sources, not me. I know so little. But here in this presentation, I once again remind you, this is a bit of my own kind of putting the pieces together, and you have been forewarned. I'm looking forward, please God, to continuing this study. We're 4 sessions into the 13th principle of resurrection. There's still some ways to go, of course. There are a lot of exotic and fun questions that we have to ponder, including the 10 that we delineated from the Sa'ad Gaon last time. We have some exciting subjects upcoming. I'm looking forward to studying it with y'all together from the Torch Center in Houston, Texas. Of course, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com, and I look forward to your questions, your comments, and your feedback. Okay. Let us open the floor here. Again, we have people in the room, and we have people on Zoom. The room and Zoom. So let us open the floor. Whoever wants to jump in first, we could do like a rotation, the Zoom and the room, so that way everyone's represented here, or not. I don't know. We don't believe so much in democracy, right? We don't believe in that so much. We like a benevolent autocracy.
Rabbi, this is
Yeah.
Eliana.
Yes.
Outstanding way of looking at this.
Oh, thank you.
And I see as you go through the steps, but in my mind, I can't quite gel it yet. I need to go back to these sources and read them again and just let it percolate a little more.
Eliana, you're not the only one who's like that. I need to do. Yeah, everyone in the room is like, yeah, me too, me too, me too. Yes. And that's why I tried to give everyone the sources. And of course, when it's going to be released on the podcast, I'll have all the sources. You can listen to them, and you can always email me for the sources as well.
Okay.
So it's very, very important. This is not one of those, you hear it once and one and done. This is advanced. What can I say? It's advanced. I always say that the podcast is titled Torah 101. You listen to it 101 times, you'll get it, no problem. Okay, I see
Thank you.
Bruce in the chat is asking the question: how many years between Jacob and Moshe's birth? Who can answer that question? How many years between Jacob and Moshe's birth? I know the answer, and I'll prove it to you.
Yeah, the trick for me is, and there arose a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph.
Okay.
I don't know how long that is.
Oh, okay. So Jacob was 130 when he met Pharaoh when he arrived in Egypt. That's a verse in Genesis.
Right.
We know the calculation is that the Jewish people were in Egypt for 210 years, and Moshe was 80 years at the time of the Exodus. So if you deduct 80 from 210, you once again arrive at 130. So 130 plus 130 will tell us the answer to your question. The answer is 260. 260 years between the birth of Jacob and the birth of Moshe.
Now, see, the reason I was thinking of that is that it may be that Jacob didn't really know the laws of the Torah yet.
It's a different subject because it's that's a much bigger subject.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah,
Sorry.
interesting.
But thank you.
Who's next? Anyone in the room here? Anybody? Anybody? Everyone's tongue-tied. I love it. I love it. I guess I don't know if that means either I did my job or I didn't. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Mike.
So that they are going to be risen in the time of the Mashiach.
Yes.
They're going to be righteous.
Yes.
The grave's going to be open.
Yes.
Now, are these righteous people in Israel and in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel also?
Okay, let me repeat your question for anyone who didn't hear it. You're saying the people that are going to be brought to life or brought to surface in the times of Messiah, they'll be righteous. But your question was, are they those?
Land of Israel only or all over the world?
I believe it's all over the world, but there is some sort of process by which they have to go to Israel.
Okay, so that's when the rolling comes in for those outside.
It seems like it. Seems like it.
And last follow-up question: are the righteous included the righteous of the nations?
Yeah, so we spoke about that last time. That was one of our questions. That's one of the subjects we have to cover. The resurrection in the resurrection of the righteous Gentiles, but even Gentiles in general, because there's going to be a universal resurrection for everyone. And we'll talk more about that. That's part of our upcoming one of the cascading subjects from that will emerge from our studies. Okay, who else? This is not easy stuff. I mean, next time we'll do something really, really light. I'll tell you stories.
Joe has his hand raised.
I'm sorry?
Joe has his hand raised.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I was going to keep my mouth shut because this might be off topic. If it is, just say cancel. But before you die, apparently you gotta, or before you get resurrected, there's got to be death. And I was looking at I've been reading the book of Jeremiah, and he mentioned that, I guess this is a warning to Israel and Judah, not to the United States of America, but that the Lord of hosts will send upon the Israelites and Judeans sword, famine, and pestilence. That's in Jeremiah 29:17. And I was looking at that word pestilence because a similar term is used in Exodus to refer to plagues of boils and plagues of death on the firstborn. And that got me to thinking about disease, public health. And I looked up the public health rates in the United States to see if there's any pestilence here. And apparently in 2018, half the population had chronic disease. And now that rate, 5 years later, that rate has gone up to 60%, which is a lot. More than half the population has chronic disease. So I'm wondering, is it plausible that our Creator is afflicting the United States right now with pestilence?
Well, that's a great question. I love it. So you started off by saying that resurrection must follow death. And we're looking at the death that is described in Jeremiah, chapter 29, which is, there's certain sword and famine and pestilence. Maybe that's being manifested today in the United States because we see a decline in public health. again, I have to always reiterate that I'm not a prophet. And the joke that I always say is not only am I not a prophet, but I work for a nonprofit organization. That's what I do, right? So how could I know? How can I know for certain what, what, to attribute events on the ground to prophecies foretold in the prophets? That's something you need to be a prophet yourself, or at least close to a prophet yourself, to be able to do. So I'm not going to do that because it's hard for me to say, right? Typically, when we think of Jeremiah, just to use your example, Jeremiah is considered to be the prophet who is foretelling about the first destruction of the temple, the destruction of the first temple. He's the one who wrote, for example, Lamentations, Eicha. And we look at his prophecy as foretelling events that happened then. We know that there was sword, there was famine, and there was pestilence in the times of the destruction of the first temple. So I would say, just to use your particular example, I would say it's probably more appropriate for the events that happened in the destruction of the first temple than today. That said, it's still possible that there are, patterns that repeat itself. And maybe the decline of public health is some sort of messianic harbinger. Some answer to that question is, I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. Maybe. But it's also important to remember, we don't want to conflate Messiah and resurrection. They're two separate principles. Messiah was principle number 12, and it will have an element of resurrection to it, but there's principle number 13, which is resurrection. And today what we're saying is that the resurrection in times of Messiah, it's not really taking the dead and bringing them alive. It's taking them alive and just opening up the grave so that they can climb out. So I don't know if we can interpret the events that are happening today before Messiah comes. We can say that they are indicative of the resurrection, because the resurrection, at least the resurrection, not just the resurrection of the opening of the graves, that is an event that happens subsequently. But it's a very, again, all these subjects are so interesting and so intriguing and so mysterious. So every question I have to start with that same disclaimer. I don't know. I have to say that again and again, so that way you don't you don't take me for my word. I always want people to go to the sources, check my work, see if it makes sense, and find those loose ends, because there are some loose ends. I didn't even tell you about the loose ends, but there are some loose ends. Mike got close to finding them, but you got close, Mike. I figured if I just confuse them enough, they'll just buy what I have to say. That's my plan. I'm sticking to it until someone has a better plan.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Go ahead, Nancy.
And we always want to define our terms. So defining dead and defining alive could be the separation of body and soul and the joining of body and soul. Would you agree that that's a good definition for those terms?
I think it's a good definition for us. I wonder if it's going to be helpful in our particular area of investigation, because suppose body and soul are separate on some level, but they're not separate on a different level. What do you do then? Suppose soul still has a foothold in the body's still alive by some measure. Our body needs to have oxygen. Maybe this is obvious. We need to have oxygen. If someone's buried in Rav Nachman's property, they don't have oxygen. Yet you dig him up and he's talking to you. So what does that even mean? Now, how can we say the body is alive when there's no oxygen? The body needs to have oxygen. So obviously that there is some sort of change that happens that happened to the person who's buried there. They're alive, but they don't need what the human body needs. I will tell you an analog to this. There's an analog to this, and this is something we'll touch yet again. We have a documentation of a person who was alive by everyone's standards. Didn't need to eat, didn't need to drink, didn't need to sleep for 40 days. And I see in my video, I see that Sandy over there is nodding. Sandy knows exactly what I'm talking about. 3 times Moshe goes up the mountain. And he tells us again and again, I didn't eat, didn't drink. What? He's alive. How does he not eat, not drink for 40 days and not die? Evidently, there's a version of life, body and soul together, but it's so elevated that it might as well be a soul. And just like a soul doesn't need food and water and oxygen, that person, the body is so tertiary, so it's so ancillary to the person, the body doesn't even need to, need food or oxygen or water. Moshe is the analog to it. So for us to use our frames of reference of what life and what death constitute for these people and these titans, I think it's probably it's not doing the subject sufficient justice. And again, we have humility. You get to these subjects, there's no way to emerge without any humility. Like, whoa, there's so many different moving parts, and it's so confusing and it's so intricate, and that's okay. That's okay. But
well, that's why I was thinking that that this person that Rabbi Nachman talked to was considered alive because his soul and his body were still connected.
Yes, but would I say that his soul was not enjoying whatever experiences the souls enjoy in heaven after death? I would have a very hard time saying that the soul of this person had no foothold, no beachhead in heaven. I would have a very hard time saying that. In fact, I would say definitively that someone so righteous that they're still alive, their body's still alive, can't be that their soul is locked out of paradise. Can't be. So how exactly does that work? Wow, that's a hard question. We can only work with the sources that we have and what they tell us. And if we find more sources, we're going to add them as well, of course. There's certainly
Rabbi?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Hey, go ahead. No, you're good. You're good. No, we just had a contribution from the room, a way of defining it, that they are alive, but in a different dimension. And the soul, as we already talked about, the soul is not the easiest thing for us to even define what it is, right? Because the soul's got 5 different parts, but even the 5 different parts, we spoke about this at length. The nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, yechid, and each one of them is comprised of smaller parts and 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 smaller parts, ad infinitum, perhaps. So the fact that a little foothold of the soul can be in the body, but the rest of the soul could be in heaven, that's not something which we will have a hard time understanding. But yes, certainly a way to say it exists on a different dimension in heaven. Yes. Go ahead, David.
I think this kind of dovetails off of that. And we talked about this last time, I believe, Rabbi, but I believe that in essence, we are still in the process of creation, or God is still in the process of creation. And resurrection is, one of the things that it will happen, towards the end of God's creation of the world that He wants, and so from that standpoint, it's miraculous, and just like how God created things out of nothing at the beginning of creation, He's going to do again with this concept of resurrection. So to some extent, I think we're trying to put words on and trying to explain, which we should, what's going to happen with resurrection. But I think to some extent it's unknowable because it's part of God's, creation. And I think everything that you said makes 100% sense to me. But the questions and the confusing nature of it comes from the fact that we are human and don't understand how God is going to make it happen, but God's going to make it happen.
Yeah,
And I don't know if that's oversimplification on my
I love
end,
it.
but
I love particularly the way you framed it as resurrection, really the world to come, is the world once this world is completed and perfected and it reaches its completion stage, that's when the next world can commence. And we know that Adam was designed initially to live forever. God says, you eat from the tree, you're not going to live forever. You have to go through this whole process. Okay, well, what if we are able to restore back to the state of Adam before his sin? If we could do that, well, then we can live forever. Why not? And
that's crazy, because I was thinking about the same exact thing. That in essence, the creation of this world started off with the Garden of Eden and Adam in this different state, and then it went a different path because of decisions that were made. But the whole idea for God is to create the world that he wants, right?
yes.
He's
The world
God.
that he
He's going to
wanted
get the world he wants.
Exactly. The world he wanted is the world where there's life and no death.
Right, which is the world to come. So it's like we
do a lot of work to get back to that point where we become eligible for that.
Right, exactly.
And that's what we're doing right now. Congratulations. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, we're going to cover that because that's a major component of the big picture of understanding resurrection and Olam Haba and the kind of the larger picture. But the great framing of saying that this is when we complete Genesis, this time correctly, then we can actually merit the Shabbos that comes afterwards, which is the enjoyment of the work that we did here. That's Olam Haba. Wow. My head's spinning a little bit. Listen, I don't know what else to do. Is there any other way that we could study the subject without going into the depths of it? There's no way to do it, right? Oh, thank you, Stanley. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else wants to say something, question, comment, feedback, both in the room and in the Zoom? Yeah, go ahead, Sandy.
Comment made me think of, we talked about sleep is 1/60th of death. So if we take that template, could we apply that to the bigger picture of what we're talking about?
Oh, yeah. They're sleeping in the grave. Wake up time.
But most of their soul has gone on.
Oh.
But there's still some connection.
Yeah, that's a very good way to frame it. So if you didn't hear that on the Zoom, what Sandy was saying is that we spoke about death as being an element of, sleep being an element of death, like a 60th of death, a small percentage, a non-negligible element of death. Well, in the morning you wake up, so your soul goes up to heaven at night, but something stays behind, right? The idea of the soul existing on different dimensions in heaven and earth, that's what you're saying, right, Sandy? That is something we see already in sleep. So why can't we see the same thing in, the death, so to speak, of those who are not really dead? Their soul is in heaven, but there's an element of the body is asleep. So maybe a bigger portion, it's not a 60th of, maybe we can say like this. When we sleep, it's a 60th of death. When they die, it's a 60th of life. It remains behind. Something like that. That's a great way to frame it. Oh, I like that.
That's really good.
I like that.
Also,
a 60th of life remains. So they're primarily there. A small percentage is still there. But it's just like you could sleep and reverse it or bring the totality of your soul back here. You could wake up and have the totality of your soul come back here for times of Messiah. Wow. Great way to frame it. Yes. Wow, I like that. So
also something else interesting, Rabbi, it's the reason why it's such a strong tradition in Judaism, but to make sure that you treat a body with such respect and reverence before it's put into the ground, the way it's processed, it had to be discarded like trash.
Of course.
Because the human body is something.
And yes, 100%. And certainly not cremated. Right. No. We'll talk more about the idea of putting the body in the ground as a form of planting. You don't want to burn your seed. Put the seed in the ground, you don't want to destroy it beforehand. Yeah.
Would righteous people be
whole now?
Why not? If they're not envious, their bones won't rot. Right, because envy is an element of lack of faith. We think of faith as being something different than envy. Those things don't necessarily go together. But envy is a manifestation of a lack of faith. Because I'm envious because, like, why do they have what they have? If you have real faith, you know that they have what they have because God gave them what they have. And they have what they have because that's what they need. And you have what you have because God gave you what you have and what you need. It doesn't make any sense for me to be envious if you have real faith. So when he's saying that the envy, that's what kills a person, it's another way of saying lack of faith is what kills a person. Someone has 100% faith in God. Why would the body decompose? Yeah, they will die for a moment before resurrection. But yeah, there are documented instances, and besides from one of the Talmud, but there are documented instances of when they had to exhume bodies of the righteous, they found them to be completely intact. The Gaon of Vilna, for example, the Gaon of Vilna was exhumed. Most people don't know this. Gaon of Vilna, Gaon, of the city of Vilnius, Gaon of Vilna, 1720 to 1797. He was exhumed in the 1950s, 1960s, because the Soviets wanted to build a train station, I think, over the Jewish cemetery, and they allowed them to exhume a few bodies to move them to a different cemetery. And they exhumed the body of the Gaon of Vilna, and they found him 150 years after he died, completely intact.
They were concerned that it was actually a crime scene.
Is that true?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
They thought it was freshly buried.
Yeah.
Body.
What was that?
Rod is saying that they thought it was Rod is saying that they considered it to be a crime scene because they found the body. The body was just freshly buried. Like, why is that in the ground?
I had never heard that. That's amazing.
Yeah. This is a documented story in modern times.
Yes.
Yeah, it's documented that they found the body completely intact.
That's crazy.
And I would imagine that if the people who exhumed the body, if they were righteous enough, he would have talked to them. Said, I don't want to go have tea with you. Sorry, not ready for that. When God opens the grave.
I'd rather keep turning again for lunch. I don't think I want to eat lunch.
Yeah. Yeah. Is this fun or is this fun?
Fantastic.
So what's the first Sunday in January? What's that? First Sunday in January is January 7th. Okay, I guess we'll get back together here live in person January 7th. But please God, every Sunday till then, we'll be together here. I'm not planning on skipping any Sundays. The 10th, 17th, 24th, and December 31st. I hope to be here. I hope to be here. My kids will all be off from school, but that's fine. I hope to be here.
So we're on for the first Sunday of January.
Yeah, right now, unless we change plans, we'll meet live in person if you can make it here. First of the month, and also first of the month we'll have also an extra class, unless we have two of them. This is the first of the month of December, so we'll have a class on Tuesday night at 7:30. Not on Thursday. No, only on Zoom. Only on Zoom. If you come, I'll be nice to you. I will be nice to you if you come. But it's going to be on Zoom, and I'm looking forward to that. This is a lot of fun. I have to say that if we didn't have this group and we didn't meet every Sunday, and I wasn't forced to research this, I would never study this. Like, this is such a level that you are exactly. Very, very, very few people study these subjects on this level. It almost doesn't exist. I have books on this subject. People write books, study it, and even they don't do as good a job as we do. Okay, don't tell anyone that. Don't tell anyone that. But so I'm very fortunate to have y'all, and this is great. I'm looking forward to more sessions, please God, in good health and in great spirits. I'll see everyone on Tuesday evening at 7:30. Please, God. One more question.
When you say righteous, are you talking righteous as a tzaddik, somebody that?
Tzaddik, yeah. That's the word that the Talmud uses.
Yeah, okay, so I'm sure there are people, I'm sure I know people, but I would say the big majority of us would not be in that.
Would I qualify?
Yeah, like a Benoni, you know,
Benoni. Benoni is an in-betweener. So the question is, what constitutes a tzaddik? What are the criteria to be it? What about the Benoni, the in-between, which is not righteous, not wicked? This is a question I can't answer, right? I can't tell you what exactly are the parameters for who would qualify, who wouldn't qualify.
But that would be a good study.
That would be. That would be.
Something else that you can study.
That would be. But I will tell you, I spent a lot of time in my book addressing this sort of question. So if you read my book, you know that this kind of question of what constitutes a tzaddik, I have a few chapters on that. And then what constitutes a wicked person? And what's the definition of it? The kind of spiritual definition of it. And what about the in-betweeners? So, but it's a very advanced question. Very advanced.
10-string harp. You got to tell.
Upon a 10-string harp. Yes. Read it. You should read it before the next book comes out, which you still have some time. Upon a 10-stringed harp. Upon a 10-stringed harp. Yes, we have a copy of it over here. Yes. I have to say, well, I want to quote someone else who said it's a masterpiece. It's not an easy read. No, not Paul. Oh, one of the greatest rabbis in the entire world told me it's a masterpiece.
Oh, wow. You should get an approbation.
That's fine. I tried to. He was too busy, whatever. But he told me, he read half the book. He says it's a masterpiece. His words, not mine. His words, not mine. I happen to agree. What can I say? But I'm a little biased. But it's not an easy read. Not an easy read. It's not. The next book will be easier. But it's the scope is very expansive, and Paul's not in the group here, so I could say it. Paul told me he read it 6 times.
You could put that in an audio book too. Have you thought about that?
I did think about it. Yeah. Not when I'm so congested I can't read a book.
We'll find somebody.
Okay, everyone, this is great. Anyone else on the Zoom wants to chime in before we sign off? This was awesome. Thank you all. I'll see everyone on Tuesday evening at 7:30 or Sunday, next Sunday, please God, at the same time. Just on Zoom next week. If you come, I'll still be nice to you. Again, as I mentioned. This was great. I'm looking forward. And I appreciate all of y'all, and I'll see y'all, please God, next time, Tuesday night and Sunday. Take care, everyone.